Hello, welcome to Media Roots Radio. This is Robbie Martin.
And this is Abby Martin.
Hope everybody is doing well out there.
Hope everyone's doing really, really good. This week is the 17-year anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, Robbie.
Yeah, I celebrated by wearing an American flag cape, eating like 12 hot dogs, burning an effigy of the World Trade Centers on my front lawn.
Oh, it's Dick Cheney's favorite holiday, and Giuliani's favorite holiday. It's so great that the people who were involved in these massive, quote-unquote, failures of intelligence on the day of the attacks have been just catapulted to extremely high positions of power since that day, Robbie, and we can get into that in a second, but most notably, I mean, Giuliani. You know, he's side by side with Trump right now. He was the 9/11 criminal.
We don't have to go into too much detail about it, but there's a lot of information out there about how Giuliani, even if you don't even go into the conspiracy realm, there's several bizarre things about his behavior on the day of 9/11. He was supposed to actually stay in this thing called the OEM command bunker in Building 7 as the attacks were happening. It was designed to be a command center during an emergency or a terrorist attack. He evacuated this command center. He did these walking press conferences on 9/11, spending all this time talking to the media, acting like a hero. While this was happening, firefighters trying to rescue people out of the towers had no idea that the towers were going to collapse. Why would they think that? No other building that had severe damage had ever collapsed like that before. It didn't cross anyone's mind, especially the firefighters, that this building would collapse. Tons of firefighters went in there. Apparently, Rudy Giuliani, according to his own quotes, was told by someone from the OEM command bunker that one of the towers was about to collapse before any of the towers collapsed. So he tried to escape and got everybody out of there. The odd thing about that is there's not even any record that Rudy Giuliani or his city government officials tried to warn any of the firefighters about that happening. So somehow Rudy Giuliani was privileged enough to know this information and save his own life and the life of his aides or whatever. And on top of that, even if they wanted to convey that information to the firefighters in the towers, apparently their radios weren't even capable of it because Rudy Giuliani had not upgraded their radios. This was something that firefighters were furious about after 9/11 and turned into a big deal at the commission hearings. You actually see people standing up and screaming at Giuliani during the 9/11 commission hearings because he didn't upgrade the firefighters to the proper equipment that they should have had. And in a lot of ways, he's responsible for their deaths for multiple reasons. The official narrative now is that Rudy Giuliani, with the FBI and other government agencies, wanted to really quickly clean up the World Trade Center crime scene because they wanted Wall Street to reopen. That's sort of like the cynical, oh, those motherfuckers wanted to reopen Wall Street, sacrifice people's health. They didn't look for all the human remains like they really should have thoroughly. And some of these companies that dispose of the steel have actually connections to the mafia. Rudy Giuliani's family is connected to the mafia. Rudy Giuliani is an extremely dirty figure. I mean, it even goes back to helping cover up things with the BCCI and General Noriega. There's a very bizarre history with Rudy Giuliani going back to the deep state in the 80s.
By the end of this year, more people will have died from the toxic exposure from 9/11 that were actually killed that day. So as we know, they said the air was safe to breathe, and thousands have been diagnosed with cancer since that day that were in the vicinity of the World Trade Center, if not first responders themselves, helping pull people out of the rubble. No accountability. People are still dying from cancer because of the criminal negligence of the government to actually tell people to go out there and not provide proper breathing masks.
Yeah, and it's definitely a continuing cover-up in the sense that the media hasn't even properly explained the fact that the World Trade Center buildings were filled to the brim with asbestos. And a lot of these deaths, as far as I understand, are actually mesothelioma.
Yep.
Just thinking about it logically, when the World Trade Center buildings were built in the early 70s, asbestos abatement wasn't even like a thing in law yet. It was still legal to fill buildings with asbestos. The World Trade Center buildings were the biggest in the world at the time, right before the asbestos laws really came into effect. Think about how much fucking asbestos must have been in there.
Oh my God.
It's hard to actually technically compare, but you could make the argument that it had the most asbestos in that structure of any buildings ever built in the world at the time.
Right.
That's pretty fucking nuts. That just general American public isn't aware of that. And that's sort of been hidden from us. Why is it toxic dust? They demolish buildings in other parts of the world, and people around that building that got demolished don't all die of cancer.
Right.
There's something obviously being hidden from us about that. And that's what I mean by continuing cover up. It's not just we wanted to reopen Wall Street. It's darker. It's just really sick.
Yeah. And you just did a really extensive, almost 2-hour interview with the authors of The Watchdogs Didn't Bark. It's an incredible book, just a extremely mind-numbing story that I didn't even realize was part of this entire cover-up, that it really just leaves some glaring holes and just dire questions about the attacks, namely these intelligence agencies that not necessarily colluded, but omitted and obfuscated direct evidence that would have led to the prevention of the attacks, namely the CIA, but also the NSA. Why don't we just go over that really quickly, just the bare bones of this?
I mean, we often hear the 9/11 official narrative is that there were these intelligence failures and that it was incompetence and the rivalry between agencies that caused the attacks. And that's sort of what let the attacks occur. More or less what we've been told over time. The third thing I just mentioned, that the rivalry between agencies is what basically caused the attacks and let them slip through. There is a kernel of truth to that, only in the sense that what's been revealed in John Duffy and Ray Novoselsky's book is that the CIA specifically deliberately withheld information that could have instantly unraveled the entire 9/11 plot. Not only did they deliberately withhold it, they did it for almost an entire year. They had ample opportunities to share this information with the FBI and the White House, and apparently they did not. On top of that, they actually created a fake paper trail to make it appear that they had told the FBI when they actually, in fact, did not. When you take all this into account, it really does make it appear that the CIA was actually complicit in the 9/11 attacks. And when I say that, I mean that they knew that a USS Cole plotter, someone who was on a terrorist watch list, who they believed was instrumental in organizing the USS Cole bombing, they allowed him to enter the United States, live in San Diego, and these two guys were taking flying lessons, were linking up with other people that had links to suspected terrorism, and then were able to buy plane tickets and board the planes and carry out the attacks. One of the interesting things that came out of John and Ray's research is that Richard Clarke is actually the one who really sort of honed in on this, that he believes that if the CIA told anybody, even if they just told him, that they
because
would have
he was tasked with counterterrorism, he was the top of the counterterrorism unit.
Yeah, he believes that if he had that information, he could have stopped the attack like as late as 9/10, I think he said.
Yeah. Basically, what this comes down to in the main crux of what Richard Clarke had revealed, because George Tenet initially during the 9/11 Commission hearings said that this one memo letting the CIA know that these two guys were in the U.S. wasn't marked urgent. It wasn't really seen by anyone. What Richard Clarke kind of revealed was at least a year before 9/11, at least 50 CIA counterterrorism agents knew that these two terrorists with homicidal intentions, again, they were already complicit in the USS Cole bombing, so they already knew that they were terrorists. They had been granted visas to live in the US, and they were never put on a watch list. We're talking about over 50 people who were in the loop of this, and then omitting that information purposefully from Richard Clarke.
Yep.
And the NSA knew about these guys too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's one of the weird things. The NSA has also lied about it after the fact and said they were monitoring. They call it like a terrorist safe house in Yemen. They were monitoring it, and this safe house was called by some of these 9/11 hijackers that were living inside the United States. And the NSA claims, this is the most unbelievable part of their claim, is they claim, We figured that there was like some terrorist communications coming in, but we couldn't see what number was like calling in. We didn't know what number it was, so we couldn't like trace it back to who it was. So that's obviously a cover story because it's been proven after the fact that now that we know the NSA was monitoring this specific location, that's the only excuse they can make. Obviously, it's a totally unbelievable excuse, but that's the official excuse. So it's amazing to me that we're still sitting here in 2018. It's baffling to me that there are still people out there who think that it's batshit or crazy to dig into these things.
Yeah, and every time someone wants to defame me, they just pull that up. But here we are, Robbie, where, a 2016 poll, according to Newsweek, found that a majority of Americans believe the government's hiding something about the attacks.
Yeah.
54% of Americans understand that something is deeply wrong with the narrative that we've been given from these war criminals who then pursued a policy of death and destruction to this day and institutionalized war crimes and torture. I think that a really important part of the Watchdogs Didn't Bark is talking about, they bring it to today. It's not just what they refer to as another 9/11 book. They hone in on these agencies and they ask, why do they keep doing this again and again? It wasn't just 9/11. It's every single time we hear that America is this moral force, then why is it that our intelligence agencies continue to do the wrong thing and quote unquote these evil acts around the world? And not only that, but when it comes to this internal investigations and stuff, the people who were the most intimately responsible for the quote-unquote intelligence failures, and they point their names out. They were the first people to really expose some of these people hiding in the shadows of the CIA and a lot of these other agencies as being instrumental in the failures. Those people were heavily rewarded.
Oh my God.
Were heavily promoted, where you have people that just went on seamlessly to run renditions, torture programs. You have one close affiliate, Gina Haspel, who's now taking on the entire agency of the CIA.
It was like the people directly responsible for dropping the ball the most and not doing anything to prevent the 9/11 attacks when they could have seemingly got promoted the most. Rich Blee, the guy that was actually revealed in Kevin Fenton's book, Disconnecting the Dots, that Ray and John later investigated because he was the head of Alex Station. He replaced Mike Scheuer, which is a guy who actually ended up marrying Alfreda Burkowski later. Alfreda Burkowski is the redhead represented in Zero Dark 30. So not only did she get rewarded by not being fired, she's now enshrined in history as this like hero. Rich Blee, immediately after being the head of the CIA Alex Station and not sharing this information with the FBI, Richard Clarke directly blames him for being in charge of that. He was actually tasked to be the head of the CIA counter-terror operation in Afghanistan against bin Laden after 9/11. As we already know, it was officially announced by the Bush administration that for some reason, they gave bin Laden 2-month lead time to escape to Pakistan. It was actually announced on the news that the first operations, the first wave of the Afghanistan assault was going to be going after like Taliban members. And then next they were going to go after like Al-Qaeda, bin Laden. And for some reason, this was announced on the news. I'm still baffled by that. I mean, that's a very strange thing. But as we know, bin Laden escaped into Pakistan. Apparently the CIA couldn't catch him, but seemingly gave him a 2-month lead time. And it was the guy in charge of it was the guy who Richard Clarke and other people have directly accused of being instrumental in allowing the 9/11 attacks to go forward. So that's a very interesting example of someone who was promoted and then immediately put in a position that also had to do with post 9/11 planning. I just find that very odd.
That famous video where the Taliban says, "We will hand over bin Laden with evidence."
Yeah.
That he was responsible for the attacks. And
that's been erased from history.
Fortunately, the U.S. decided to invade and occupy another sovereign country that did nothing to us for the last 17 years, where civilian casualties are at an all-time high. And the opium production is skyrocketing through the roof. And I wanted to read a quick quote from the Newsweek article that is going more in depth about their book, which is amazing that Newsweek even published this. Like you said in the last episode, here we are 17 years later and somehow this isn't taboo to talk about this stuff, even though it gravely implicates the CIA, which is very harrowing, or it should be to these DC Beltway pundits. So Newsweek quotes Ali Soufan. He's one of the lead FBI counterterrorism agents whom the CIA kept in the dark about these Al-Qaeda hijackers that we were talking about. He says, quote, "It's horrible. We still don't know what happened." And he says 9/11 changed the whole world. So to him and many other former national security officials, 9/11 and these unanswered questions dwarf JFK. He says 9/11 changed the whole world. It not only led to the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, the fracturing of the Middle East, the global growth of Islamic militantism, but also pushed the U.S. closer to being a virtual homeland security police state. Quote, "I'm sad and depressed about it," said Mark Rossini, one of the 2 FBI agents assigned to the CIA's Osama bin Laden unit, who says the agency managers mysteriously blocked them from informing their headquarters about future al-Qaeda plotters present in the U.S. Quote, "It's patently evident the attacks did not need to happen, and there has been no justice." And before we quickly get into Saudi Arabia, Robbie, what is your response to Richard Clarke and others who will say, well, why? Why did they block this? According to these people, they were trying to recruit these hijackers as informants.
And just a clarification, that is apparently just a theory that Richard Clarke has concocted to explain why he believes that this information was blocked to any other government agency, because he has said that information would have automatically gone to him on the CIA briefings that would come up daily if these 2 hijackers were in the United States. That's what his conclusion is, that for some reason, the only reason he can think of that they didn't tell anybody was because they were trying to recruit them. Unfortunately, that theory just doesn't hold any water really whatsoever.
Why?
And I'll explain why. I mean, actually, the words of Paul Thompson, who actually was the author of the 9/11 terror timeline that 9/11 Press for Truth, Ray and John's movie, was partly based on. Paul Thompson, to me, is one of the most knowledgeable people about 9/11. He's also one of the most responsible, quote-unquote, truthers, in the sense that he wouldn't even call himself that, but he has an encyclopedic knowledge of it. HistoryCommons.org is basically based around his original terror timeline. It's an amazing resource. Anybody who's interested in studying this stuff should look at that website. It's a very, very important resource. So here's what Paul Thompson actually said in an interview with John Gold about the sort of Richard Clarke reasoning. John Gold's book is free. You can go directly to page 976 to read this section. Paul says, I'll quote just a section of this. He says, "I mean, that doesn't make any sense." And he's directly referencing the Clarke theory. You know, there's rules about informants. Like if you are moles, let's just say you're a mole within the mafia, right? And if you start doing actual assassinations on behalf of the mafia, that's the point that the whole operation says, whoa, stop this guy, pull him out, maybe charge him with murder. You just don't continue to use that person as an informant, no matter what they're getting, because that person has just killed people. That's how law enforcement has always operated. So the idea that these people would be allowed to take part in the Cole bombing, and then you're just continuing to allow all this to happen, just doesn't make any sense. Furthermore, I mean, if you're looking at who would you turn, these guys would be last on your list. As I said, they fought in Bosnia, fought in Chechnya. They've taken part in just about every Al-Qaeda major terrorist operation of the last 10 years, and you would expect them to all of a sudden say, yeah, I think I'll go join the U.S. and work for them. What are the odds of that happening? It makes no sense. And then John responds with, it makes no sense to me, but I don't have an honest theory as to why it did happen. And he says, I don't know why they did it, but I don't think Clarke's theory stands up to scrutiny. And Paul responds again with, if I were to be generous and play devil's advocate, you might argue that there was, you could argue a lot of different things. But one thing you might argue is like maybe the Saudis are playing a double game because these people like Buyami and Bassan really had their loyalty with these Islamic militancy. And they would say, we're watching these guys and they're just living normal lives, nothing to report. They haven't contacted anybody anywhere and so on and so forth, right? So then it's just this colossal screw up and the CIA got played by the Saudis. And they never figured it out until it was too late to find out who these guys really were, that they were Al-Qaeda. But that doesn't make any sense either for a lot of reasons. One is that, as I said, Nawaf al-Hazmi was on the move most of the time. Khalid al-Midhar was involved in all kinds of intrigues, and on 3 separate occasions he went back to the Yemen hub and lived there for a significant period of time, like maybe a month or 2 months. And you have to remember how monitored the Yemen hub was. He's talking about the NSA monitoring it, and how poor their operational security was. So actually he's adding another interesting layer to that narrative where it's like one of the hijackers actually went back to this Yemen hub that was being monitored 24 hours a day by the NSA. So there's like so many things you can add. Right. And everyone talks about Muhammad Atta being the ringleader behind this. In actuality, between these 2 hijackers, one of them, I forgot which of the 2, had directly met bin Laden and is actually one of bin Laden's closest associates of all the 19 hijackers. That adds another layer of completely unbelievability to the story, that they would let someone in to the country, buy plane tickets, who's already allegedly committed a terrorist attack, who was already known bin Laden personally, and just let him do this? I mean, it's absolutely fantastic.
It's one thing to just have this attack come and you had no idea, and then you kind of cover your ass and you're like, all right, well, let's not fire anyone. Let's just try to move on and secure our intelligence moving forward. But they didn't do that at all. They actually went after people like Tom Drake, like Bill Binney, people who were trying to call into question, people who built this NSA surveillance system that was designed to prevent things like this. And they just decided to prosecute them to the nth degree. And that was another interesting point, is the amount that they've actually targeted whistleblowers from 9/11. Another really interesting point from the book is just talking about, obviously, Saudi Arabia's complicity. Saudi Arabia, an official messaging arm of Saudi Arabia, just recently threatened Toronto and actually Canadian diplomats and the government to basically conduct a 9/11 style terrorist attack in Toronto. They tweeted a photo saying, don't poke your nose in where it doesn't belong and you won't get things that you don't want, something like that. And it was just a photo of a plane going into the cityscape of Toronto. Very shocking. Let's just talk really briefly about Saudi Arabia before we move on to other headlines. Actually, let me start with this. The official 9/11 Commission said that it found no evidence that the Saudi government as an institution or senior Saudi officials individually funded al-Qaeda or really had anything to do with the attacks whatsoever, Robbie. So what is your response to that?
Well, we know that that's not true. We have already these fake charity fronts that money was being funneled to al-Qaeda. One of them, actually, Bandar Bush, the ambassador to the U.S. from Saudi Arabia, who was given a nickname by the Bush family, was directly complicit in helping basically launder and funnel this money to al-Qaeda. I mean, it's actually pretty fucking nuts that this motherfucker and the Bush administration got away with this shit and the news didn't blow this up into a bigger story.
Well, it's interesting, too, because they talk about this wall of silence kind of, between these agencies and also between these agencies and the White House, and even speculating that very few people in the Bush administration proper actually were privy to any of this, which is fascinating because if that's true, which I tend to believe, why would Bush, who was so close to Bandar, they were like brothers, obviously that's the nickname Bandar Bush, and of course flying out the entire bin Laden family and when everyone else was grounded, why wouldn't Bush and a lot of other close allies to the Saudi royal family say, hey, hold on, this is crazy, we found this out about Bandar, we're gonna fucking cut ties with you. Especially if they were just, it was totally surprise. And instead they did the opposite.
Not only that, I mean, Richard Clarke, he worked for the Bush administration, he worked for the Clinton administration. I'm not going to take things that he says at face value, especially when you factor in the fact that he was the one responsible for flying out the remaining bin Laden family members who were in the United States. He's taking credit for that. None of them were interrogated by the FBI or any other government agency.
Just to wrap this up, in this Newsweek article, it talks about how agency officers basically think that, quote, dissident sympathizers within the Saudi government supported bin Laden. Moreover, subsequent investigations have revealed that the kingdom's Islamic Affairs Ministry were actively helping the hijackers get settled in California. Last year, agents of the monarchy were discovered surreptitiously funding a PR effort to derail that bill that allowed those 9/11 families to sue the kingdom. Yeah, so that's where we're at today.
And unfortunately, what this has done is a lot of people have spun a lot of these new revelations as things that directly implicate Saudi Arabia and not other entities like in the United States. That is kind of almost a textbook limited hangout to like go only in that narrative direction with it, because it totally omits these sort of really crucial, seemingly U.S. involvement.
Even by proxy, the cover-up makes the U.S. complicit.
Well, so if we're just looking at it from the angle of a cover-up, then yes, you're absolutely right. But it goes so much deeper than that, and that's the part that's fascinating, is this limited hangout variation is not even going as far as what you just said, Abby, but which actually isn't far enough anyways. Journalists are simply, I think, just too afraid to touch it. It still is a third rail. The safest thing to say is that We now have proof that there is some Saudi involvement, but that's in a very limited sphere to only go that far. It needs to go so much further than that.
That really shows you everything. It's just the fear and terror of these Beltway reporters who are just essentially stenographers. They're desperate for access. I mean, it's really just a cult at this point of, it's a weird pathology that I've noticed in recent weeks with a lot of the scandal of the DSA that's going on with this one candidate. It just seems like there's this weird human psychology that is just willful blindness.
Absolutely.
And I think that that's the crux of 9/11 truth. And it's really unfortunate because here we are, like you said, 17 years later, Bush is on a book tour. These people are now involved in actually censoring the internet. Like a lot of these Bush era criminals that are just still floating around behind the scenes.